Welcome to Sherlock Tales, where every mystery comes alive. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, give this video a like, and share it with your fellow mystery lovers. Tell us in the comments, which part of the world are you watching from? Let's solve mysteries together.
It was on a sodden morning in late October of 1891 that I, Dr. John H. Watson, found myself summoned back to 221B Baker Street by a most peculiar telegram. The note, scrawled in an uneven, frantic hand, bore neither a return address nor a clear sender, and yet the words were addressed not to Holmes, as most such mysteries were, but to me. To Dr. Watson, please come at once. I am in grave danger of being murdered. By the time you read this, I may already be dead. Yours with regret, Nathaniel Blake. What gave me pause more than the dramatic tone was the name. Nathaniel Blake was not unknown to me. In fact, I had attended his funeral just 10 days prior. With the telegram still clenched in my hand, I climbed the familiar 17 steps up to Holmes's rooms, finding the detective, as ever, a figure of serene indifference to the storms, meteorological or emotional, that swirled beyond his windows. He sat cross-legged on the Turkish rug before the fireplace, smoking a long clay pipe and eyeing a charred scrap of paper held aloft by silver tongs. "You've come quickly, Watson," he said without looking up. "I was expecting you after the third ring of the bell. Your coat is damp and you've clearly run part of the way." "I had reason to hurry," I replied, handing him the telegram. "This arrived scarcely an hour ago." Holmes took it with interest, his keen grey eyes scanning the message. Then, with a brief smile that suggested some hidden amusement, he rose to his feet. "Ah, so Mr. Nathaniel Blake, recently deceased solicitor of Gresham Street, has reached out to you from beyond the veil?" "Exactly," I said. "It's preposterous. The man was buried last Monday. I saw the coffin lowered into the ground myself." Holmes tapped the note thoughtfully against his fingers. "And yet, here we have his alleged final words written in his own hand. That much, I assume, you can confirm?" "I can," I replied. "I saw enough of his handwriting in the papers he drew up for my patient's wills. This matches it." "Interesting," Holmes murmured. He turned and plucked a slim volume from the shelf behind him, opening it to a pressed envelope. "This," he said, holding it out, "is the death announcement as published in the Times. Died of apoplexy, found by his clerk in his study, no foul play suspected. The coroner signed off within hours. And yet, I trailed off, unable to make sense of it. The man cannot write his own murder warning after he's dead." "Indeed, Watson," Holmes said, his tone sharpening. "Which leaves us two possibilities. Either Mr. Nathaniel Blake was not murdered 10 days, ergo, or someone else very much alive has taken considerable pains to convince you that he was. He moved to the fireplace and tossed in the charred scrap he'd been examining. I suggest we pay a visit to Gresham Street. Let us begin with the dead man's office. If there is truth to this telegram, it lies not beneath a headstone, but behind a solicitor's locked desk." And with that, he was already reaching for his overcoat and cane, the gleam in his eyes unmistakable. The game was once more afoot. The rain had settled into a steady drizzle by the time we hailed a hansom cab and set off toward Gresham Street, the wheels rattling over wet cobblestones, and the scent of damp smoke drifting through the open slit in the window. Holmes sat silently beside me, his eyes closed, though I knew better than to think him at rest. That ever-active mind of his, sharper than a surgeon's blade and more precise than any chronometer, was already dissecting the puzzle from several angles. He had not spoken since we left Baker Street, but his fingers tapped an absent rhythm against the ivory handle of his cane, his version of thought rendered physical. "I confess," I said at last, unable to endure the quiet, "this may be the strangest beginning to a case I've ever witnessed. A man writes to warn of his own murder days after his death." "It's absurd, is it?" Holmes murmured, not opening his eyes. "Or is it merely theatrical? Remember, Watson, the art of deception often lies in striking at what the mind resists most readily. A contradiction is a better curtain than any darkness." I let the words settle between us, turning them over as we passed by the soot-blackened front of St. Paul's Cathedral, half shrouded in mist. I could not deny the logic in Holmes's observation, though it brought me no closer to an explanation. We arrived on Gresham Street just after 9. The building at number 87 was a tall, narrow structure, wedged between a tobacconist's and a banking house. its black door framed by fluted stone columns and capped by a tarnished brass plate that read, "Blake and Harrow, Solicitors and Commissioners for Oaths." A heavy chain hung inside the vestibule, which Holmes pulled with one sharp tug. We were met by a man of perhaps 30, stooped and bespectacled, his collar hastily fastened and hair still damp from a recent combing. He blinked at us through thick lenses with an expression of weary curiosity. "Yes?" he asked. "May I help you?" "I hope so," said Holmes smoothly. "We are here regarding the late Mr. Nathaniel Blake. This is Dr. Watson. I am Mr. Holmes." The man paled slightly at the name, but to his credit, recovered swiftly. "Of course. Do come in. I'm Charles Harrow, his partner." We were shown through a musty vestibule and into a modest waiting room, where worn chairs flanked a small fireplace and a framed certificate from the inner temple hung askew on the wall. Harrow gestured toward a pair of chairs and then sat opposite us, clasping his hands tightly as if trying to suppress some nervous energy. "I assume you're not here on legal business," he said, "but I must confess I don't see what more there is to say. Nathaniel's death was quite straightforward. The coroner found no suspicious circumstances, and yet," said Holmes, withdrawing the telegram from his coat pocket with delicate fingers, "this note reached Dr. Watson this morning. You'll observe the signature." Harrow took the slip of paper with trembling hands. He read it once, twice, then let out a short breath that might have been a gasp or a laugh. It was difficult to tell. This is Blake's handwriting," he murmured. "It's his without question. But how is that possible?" "That's precisely what we're here to find out," Holmes said. "Now just tell me about the day he died. Spare no detail, however small." Harrow blinked, then nodded. Yes, of course. It was just after 6 in the evening on the 12th. I had gone home at 5:30. Nathaniel was in the habit of working late, as he often reviewed documents quietly after I left. He'd been in fine spirits that day. I remember he'd received a rather large packet in the afternoon, a stack of correspondence, I assumed, from the East End. He dealt with a number of estates out there. Was he alone in the building? Holmes asked. Entirely. Our clerk, Mr. Phipps, leaves at 5 sharp. No cleaning woman that day either. It was his habit to lock the door behind him once the building emptied. And who found him? Harrow swallowed. I did. The next morning, I returned just before 9 and found the door still locked from the inside. That was strange enough. I used my own key to enter and found him. He stopped, drawing a deep breath, slumped over his desk, pale and still. The physician said it was an apoplectic stroke. Sudden and fatal. Was anything unusual about the room? Holmes asked softly. Not that I noticed. Papers in order, fireplace dying, a glass of port untouched beside him. There was a small fire going, and it was clear he'd been reading a document just before he died. It was still beneath his hands. Holmes leaned forward. What document? I'm not certain. It was gone by the time I returned from summoning the doctor and the coroner. I assumed one of them moved it. Holmes did not respond immediately. He rose and walked to the hearth, examining the logs there with a pair of tweezers he'd drawn from his coat. After a moment, he retrieved a small half-burned scrap of parchment, the ink still visible in places. He held it to the light. Ah, he said, it appears Mr. Blake did not intend for all his records to survive him. A clumsy job. The edges are uneven. It was torn hastily. Note the seal still visible, red wax. Possibly personal correspondence, not legal. Could it have been a will? I asked. Holmes shook his head. Too short, and too thin for legal parchment. No, I believe this was a letter. Perhaps the very one that prompted his final hours. Harrow looked perplexed. But why would he destroy it and then collapse? Are you saying someone forced him to? I am saying nothing. Yet, Holmes turned back toward the door, I shall need to examine Mr. Blake's personal effects. His ledger, correspondence, and any items recently received by post. Yes, of course. I'll unlock the drawer in his study. Harrow led us down the narrow hallway into a dark panelled room lined with shelves. The desk at the center had been cleared and dusted, but not thoroughly. It retained that faint imprint of habitual use, the shallow indentations of resting wrists, a smudge of ink near the inkwell, and a scratch along the drawer's brass edge that suggested frustration, or perhaps haste. The drawer creaked as it opened. Inside, bundled with twine, were several envelopes, a leather-bound ledger and a folded parcel stamped with the seal of a small East End post office. Holmes removed the parcel and examined the postmark. Sent on the 11th, received on the 12th, just in time for him to read it before dying. He opened the twine and unwrapped the papers carefully. Inside was a sheaf of typed pages unsigned. The lines were uneven, the ribbon ink faded. Holmes's brows lifted slightly as he skimmed the first paragraph. He handed it to me. I read aloud, "To Nathaniel Blake, your sins do not lie buried with your clients. There are names that must not be hidden, transactions that will not be forgotten. You profited from the dead, and now the dead come for you. When the clock strikes the hour, may you hear them whisper in the silence." I lowered the paper slowly. A threat. More than that, Holmes said. A reckoning. Blake was being blackmailed, or worse, warned. And now I believe we know what truly killed him. But the doctors see what they expect, Holmes snapped. We shall soon know whether Mr. Blake died of fright, poison, or something far more deliberate. For now, Watson, we must find the man who delivered that parcel. And if he's vanished? I asked. Then we will dig him up from whatever grave he's hidden behind. Holmes's smile was thin. After all, if Blake could write from the dead, perhaps our culprit prefers to kill from the shadows. The rain had turned to mist as we stepped back into the street, and Holmes's eyes scanned the horizon with a hunger I had come to recognize well. Somewhere in London, a man had signed a death that the world had already mourned, and Sherlock Holmes would not rest until he signed his name again. The mist lingered as we stepped out once more onto Gresham Street, curling around our collars like the fingers of some unseen watcher. Holmes paused at the threshold, his eyes narrowing against the grey light as he tucked the threatening letter into his coat. He looked less like a man burdened by mystery than one invigorated by it. I had seen him in many states, sullen, manic, even despondent, but there was always a singular clarity in his expression when the shadows grew long and the facts began, at last, to whisper their secrets. We walked in silence for several paces until he abruptly turned on his heel and hailed a passing cab. To Commercial Street, he instructed the driver. The East End post office, nearest Spitalfields. I settled beside him, watching his long fingers pressed together as if in prayer, though his mind was far from any cathedral. You believe the parcel was posted there in person? I asked. I believe it's the only concrete lead we have, Holmes replied. The postmark was precise, the timing even more so. Whoever sent that letter meant for Blake to read it in his final hours. The style, typed, anonymous, prophetic, was meant to terrify, and it succeeded. But if the man died of fright, Blake was not a man to rattle easily, Holmes interrupted. He handled estate disputes, last wills, land entitlements. Those circles are full of secrets, but he thrived in them. No, Watson, a stroke is a convenient end, but I suspect a hand guided it. Whether through poison, suggestion, or pressure, some force brought him to that desk to die with that letter in reach. It is the sender I wish to meet. The hansom clattered eastward, cutting through the narrowing streets of London, where the stone grew grimier, the shop signs more weather-worn, and the people more watchful. By the time we reached Commercial Street, the mist had begun to lift and a dull light broke through, casting pallid reflections off the windows of pawnbrokers, tailors, and the narrow-lipped buildings of Spitalfields. The East End post office was a squat, bricked structure at the corner of Hanbury Street, its windows smeared with coal dust, and the faint trace of grease from 1,000 passing palms. Holmes held open the door with a faint nod, and we stepped into the dry, paper-scented air of bureaucracy. Behind the counter stood a matronly clerk, her face stern beneath the shadow of a netted hat. She looked up, unsurprised at our intrusion, though her gaze lingered longer on Holmes than most. "Yes?" she said without effect. "What can I help you gentlemen with?" Holmes removed the parcel's outer wrapping from his coat, careful not to expose the contents. "This was posted from here, I believe, on the afternoon of the 12th. I am investigating a legal matter on behalf of the deceased recipient. Would you recall who brought it in?" She gave him a flat look, then turned to a ledger behind the counter, flipping the pages with businesslike efficiency. "We don't take names unless registered. But yes, typed address, red wax, no return." "I remember it." Holmes's expression sharpened. Because the gentleman who brought it in paid in coin, and I had to correct his postage. He used 2 foreign stamps." "Foreign?" I echoed. She nodded. "Austrian, I think, but the letter went local. I replaced them and charged the balance." He didn't argue. Seemed like a polite fellow, if a bit odd. What do you recall of him? Holmes asked, voice like velvet. She squinted, searching her memory. Tall, long face. Well dressed, but his coat was out of place for the weather, too heavy for the day. Gloves on, I remember that. He kept his eyes down. Holmes leaned in slightly. Accent. She hesitated. Yes, foreign, not strong, but there. Eastern, maybe. He said only a few words. Didn't meet my gaze. Did he say who the letter was for? No, just laid it down and said local urgent. Then he left, quick. Holmes turned from the counter and I followed him out into the street, the door shutting behind us with a sigh of tired hinges. Well? I asked. Holmes glanced toward the rooftops. An outsider, likely Slavic or Germanic by origin. Intelligent enough to type his message, cautious enough to avoid detection, but ignorant of local postage. That narrows our suspect considerably. Then he isn't someone from Blake's usual circle. On the contrary, I think he is. But not from the side Blake advertised. Holmes's gaze returned to the street. We are dealing with a man connected to the dead. The dead. Blake's profession dealt in the last affairs of men, Watson. Wills, bequests, sealed envelopes delivered after the grave. He knew secrets not meant to be unearthed. I believe this letter came from someone who found such a secret and decided justice was not moving fast enough. A silence passed between us. Weighted by the implication. Then we must find who Blake's last clients were, I said. Holmes's smile was brief and knowing. We already have our next stop. Do you recall the name on the envelope bundle in Blake's drawer? Only vaguely, Barrowman. State of Reginald Barrowman, late of Stepney. The name struck a chord. I had seen it, some months past, in the newspapers. Barrowman had died suddenly at his home, in what was then dismissed as heart failure. There had been speculation, of course, as there always is when the affluent fall without warning, but no inquiry had followed. He died intestate, Holmes continued, but a cousin laid claim to a vast inheritance shortly after, a claim I suspect Mr. Blake facilitated. You believe the claim was fraudulent? I believe someone did, enough to send Blake a death sentence typed on borrowed paper. We arrived in Stepney within the hour. The house in question was a faded Georgian residence, tucked behind an iron gate that looked more rust than metal. Holmes knocked crisply on the door, and after a moment it was opened by a maid in a brown dress with reddened eyes and a frightened demeanor. Yes? She asked, wary. Miss, we're here to speak to Mr. Elliot Barrowman. I am Mr. Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. The name seemed to drain what little color she had left. You're too late, she whispered. Holmes straightened. Too late? She stepped back from the door. He's dead, sir. This morning, in his chair. Just like the master was. Holmes did not speak for a full 5 seconds. Then, without waiting for permission, he stepped past her and entered the hall. I followed, my heart rising with the dreadful weight of implication. The drawing room bore the unmistakable pall of a sudden death. A fire had gone out in the grate, and near the hearth sat a stiff figure in a high-backed chair, head tilted at an unnatural angle. The eyes stared forward in glassy silence, and the mouth was frozen in a half-formed word. A teacup lay broken at his feet. Watson moved forward instinctively, checking the pulse, the skin, the clarity of the eyes. Gone, I confirmed. But not long. Less than 3 hours, I'd say. No sign of trauma, no convulsion. Holmes stepped around the corpse, his expression unreadable. He sniffed the air lightly, then knelt beside the spilled tea, lifting a shard of porcelain and examining the residue on its lip. Watson, he said calmly, do you recall what is nearly tasteless, colorless, and fatal in small doses, especially when stirred into something warm? Digitalis. Cyanide? Hydrocyanic acid, Holmes said, though this variant has been prepared with unusual skill. I can detect only the faintest trace. But Elliot Barrowman, he must have known he was in danger. Unless, Holmes said, he believed the danger had passed, after Blake's death. We both looked at the body. The stillness of it, and the implications swirled. One letter reaches a dead man, Holmes said softly, and the other reaches one who was not quite dead yet. But who sent them, and why? That is the thread we must pull. And then he turned sharply to the maid, who still hovered in the hall, white as chalk. Tell me, he said, did anyone visit this house yesterday? Or this morning? She hesitated, then nodded. Yes, sir. A gentleman came by. Very polite. Said he knew Mr. Barrowman from the old days. He wore gloves. Left a parcel. Holmes's face darkened. What did the parcel look like? Brown paper, tied with twine, about the size of a book. Holmes nodded, already moving toward the hearth where a faint curl of smoke still rose from behind the screen. He reached in with the poker and pulled free a blackened clump of parchment, its surface faintly crackling. A second letter, he said grimly. Burned before the second death. His eyes met mine. We are chasing a ghost, Watson. But I believe our ghost has a name, and very soon he'll know we are on his trail. Holmes held the charred scrap at arm's length, his eyes narrowing as he examined the edges for surviving text. But the flames had done their work. Only a few half-letters remained, blackened smudges on the browned curl of paper. He dropped it into his handkerchief with the same care he might have reserved for a rare fossil. This letter was burned very recently, he said, rising. The embers were still warm. Someone wanted this message destroyed before we arrived, or perhaps before Mr. Barrowman read it in full. I gestured to the maid, who had retreated partway into the corridor. How long ago did this visitor bring the parcel? She glanced back toward the door, nervously wringing her apron. It must have been around 9 this morning, sir. Mr. Barrowman was still in his dressing gown. I showed the gentleman into the drawing room. He only stayed a minute, didn't sit down or remove his hat. Said the parcel was personal. Mr. Barrowman seemed startled when he saw the name. Holmes turned sharply. What name? The maid blinked. I didn't see, sir, but I heard Mr. Barrowman say it aloud. He looked confused, said, I thought he was dead, that's what he said. I remember it clear as day. Holmes and I exchanged a glance. Did you catch the man's appearance? He asked. She frowned, thinking. He was tall, maybe a bit stooped at the shoulders. Black coat, neat hair under a bowler. Gloves, like I said. He kept his voice quiet, low, but not English. There was an accent to it. Holmes's voice dropped. Could you place it? She hesitated. Something from the East, maybe. Not quite German, softer. Did he give a name? No, sir. He left almost before I shut the door behind him. Holmes turned from her, his expression tightening. He walked back to Barrowman's lifeless figure, now draped with a linen sheet by the constable who had just arrived. The policeman was waiting respectfully by the door, hat in hand. You'll take the body to the coroner, Holmes said without needing to introduce himself. And do not report the cause of death as natural, not yet. The constable nodded grimly and set to work. Holmes turned to me. We are dealing with a sequence, he said. First Blake, who facilitated the estate transfer. Then Barrowman, who benefited from it. But both received messages suggesting guilt, or at least complicity. One dies after receiving his warning. The other dies after seeing a name from the grave. You believe someone connected to Reginald Barrowman is behind this? I asked. I believe, Holmes said slowly, that we have not yet seen the true beginning of this case. These deaths are not the story. They are its punctuation. The tale starts with the man no one is speaking of, Reginald Barrowman himself. We left the Stepney residence under a sky that had darkened with low clouds. Holmes's silence as we walked back to the main road was deep and thoughtful. It was not the silence of puzzlement, but of calculation. By the time we reached a cab stand, he had resumed his brisk manner. To Somerset House, he told the driver. We need the probate records for Reginald Barrowman. The carriage ride passed in focused silence. Holmes's gaze remained fixed on the window, though I knew he was not watching the streets. I kept thinking of the maid's words, I thought he was dead. It echoed with unsettling clarity. At Somerset House, we were admitted to the probate registry with the assistance of Holmes's card, and a few words from the clerk, who knew the name and deferred quickly. The record was located within minutes and spread before us on a green felt desk. Holmes scanned the document. Reginald Barrowman deceased September 3rd. Cause heart failure. No inquest. Probate granted October 4th. Estate valued at £32,000. No will. Heirs. Elliot Barrowman, cousin, sole beneficiary. And filed by Nathaniel Blake, I said, pointing to the solicitor's name. Indeed. The claim moved swiftly. Too swiftly. Holmes turned the page. No objections. No contestation. He tapped the corner. But here, look, a notice. A minor footnote. I leaned in to read. An inquiry into a secondary claimant was dismissed on insufficient evidence. Identity not substantiated. Holmes straightened. There was another who claimed the inheritance. Someone who believed himself, perhaps rightly, to be a true heir. Someone who was not heard. That man, Watson, is our ghost. You think he's killing those who stood between him and the estate, or those he believes robbed him of it? Holmes rose abruptly. We must find this man, and for that, we need the clerk who handled the dismissed claim. The identity may not have made it into the probate, but someone at this desk spoke to him. The senior clerk, a Mr. Eddowes, was summoned, a tidy man in pince-nez with a cautious demeanor. At the mention of Reginald Barrowman, he grew attentive. Yes, I recall. There was a gentleman, tall, very dark hair, slight accent, claimed to be a nephew from the continent, presented a birth certificate from Bucharest, though it lacked authentication, claimed the elder Barrowman had fathered a child during his business in Romania. Did he give his name? Holmes asked. Lucian Barrowman. Holmes's eyes lit slightly. Did he leave an address? No permanent one. He said he was staying in Whitechapel at the time, but he left a card. Eddowes opened a drawer and extracted a yellowing business card. Holmes took it carefully. It read Lucian Barrowman, Interpreter Translation Services, specializing in Romanian, Hungarian, and Russian. Temporary address, 11 Bede Street, Whitechapel. Holmes's fingers closed around the card with the same satisfaction I had seen when he secured a checkmate. He thanked Eddowes and turned to me. Our ghost has a name, an address, and most interestingly, a skill set perfectly suited to writing anonymous threats with theatrical flair. A man who can borrow the voice of others. Whitechapel was less than half an hour away by cab, and we reached Bede Street by early afternoon. It was a narrow lane of tenements and iron balconies, filled with the cries of fishmongers and the metallic scent of slaughterhouses. Number 11 was a boarding house, its ground floor lined with bicycles and crates. We were met by a landlady in a heavy apron who squinted through the door's cracked opening. Lucian Barrowman, Holmes asked. Her face tightened. He left this morning. Took everything. Holmes's brows rose. Everything? She nodded. Packed it all in a satchel. Didn't say where he was going. Left the room clean. He even folded the bed sheets. Holmes's eyes slid past her to the stairwell. Might we see the room? She hesitated, then shrugged and led us up 2 flights of creaking stairs to a cramped space that smelled of old paper and shaving soap. It was bare now. No clothes, no books, no clues. But Holmes moved slowly around the room, observing the scratches on the windowsill, the thin layer of disturbed dust, the impression left by a heavy object removed from the desk. He was here no more than 5 hours ago, he murmured. But he's not running. I looked at him. No? He's circling. Holmes turned, his voice grave. First Blake, then Elliot. Both died days after dismissing Lucian's claim. He's not killing at random. He's following a line, a progression. And who is next in line? I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. He was staring at the single remaining object in the room, a sheet of hotel stationery tucked beneath the windowsill. He pulled it free. There in elegant copperplate were the embossed letters, the Brighton Grand Hotel. A moment passed before Holmes looked up. There was no mistaking the shift in his eyes. Calculation had given way to certainty. He has left London, he said, but he has not finished. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air, then neither have we. The train to Brighton departed Victoria, station under a sky smeared with the last reluctant light of afternoon. Holmes and I shared a compartment near the rear, and though we sat in silence for much of the journey, the current of urgency between us was palpable. Holmes had positioned himself beside the window, one long finger tapping against the sill with measured rhythm as the countryside blurred past. He had not lit a cigarette nor spoken since we boarded, and I knew well enough not to interrupt when he descended into such focused silence. His mind was working, calculating not only where Lucian Barrowman might be, but why he had chosen Brighton and, more crucially, who might be next. It wasn't until the train hissed its way into the station and the great iron canopy of Brighton's terminal loomed overhead that Holmes stirred. He's chosen a final act, he said, still watching the platform. Brighton is not a place one vanishes into. It is a place one announces a presence. Lucian is no longer merely eliminating those who blocked his path to the inheritance. He is about to make a statement. A public one, I asked. Holmes nodded, rising as the train shuddered to a stop. Possibly. He will want recognition, though not necessarily under his true name. And I believe he intends to speak to the dead once more, in the most theatrical setting he can find. We stepped down into the fading day, the salty scent of the sea heavy in the air. The Grand Hotel was but a short carriage ride from the station, its white facade glowing faintly in the coastal mist, a palace of gaslights and whispers overlooking the grey-green swell of the Channel. As we entered the great revolving doors, a liveried attendant greeted us with polite reserve, and Holmes immediately requested the register. The concierge handed it over without hesitation, and Holmes scanned the names with practiced speed. "There," he said, tapping a line halfway down. "Room 313 registered 2 days ago. Mr. Lewis Barron. A false name, but note the handwriting, Watson." I leaned in. The script was tight, continental, with the distinctive curled descender of the Romanian R. Holmes looked up. "We'll need to proceed carefully. Lucian will be on edge. He's laid a trail, but not for surrender. He wants us to find him, but only on his terms." As we ascended the stairs, Holmes always preferred stairs to lifts, we passed a pair of maids who quieted as we approached. Holmes paused beside them with a faint, reassuring smile. "Forgive the intrusion. I wonder if you've seen the gentleman in room 313 today?" One of them, a freckled girl of perhaps 18, nodded. "Yes, sir. Just after tea. He left around 5. Said he was going for a walk on the esplanade. Took his coat but not his gloves. Did he seem agitated?" I asked. She hesitated. "Not agitated, but solemn, like a man saying goodbye to something." Holmes nodded once and continued up the stairs. At the third-floor landing, he stopped before room 313 and listened. Silence. Then, from an inner pocket, he produced a small picklock set I had seen him use on more than one occasion. With deft hands and a quiet twist, the door opened. The room was modest but well kept, the curtains drawn, the lamp unlit. The bed was made, untouched. On the writing desk sat a small valise open, with its contents arranged in a manner more deliberate than practical, clothes folded too neatly, papers aligned with the edge. It was the stillness that struck me. This room had the air not of a man living in it, but of a stage set for an exit. Holmes moved to the desk and examined the papers. There were scraps of correspondence in Romanian, a partially written letter in English. "I did not mean for blood only to be seen," and a folded sheet containing names, Blake, Elliot Barrowman, and now beneath them a new entry, "Lady Adeline Marbury." Holmes read aloud. I started. "Marbury? The name sounds familiar. She was once engaged to Reginald Barrowman," Holmes said, eyes narrowing. "A connection from decades ago. The papers made much of it at the time." He broke it off suddenly. "Some scandal involving land and debt, but she remained unmarried. And she's here. She has a house just outside Brighton," Holmes said. "Preston Fields. It's public record. Then she's the next target." "No." Holmes's voice dropped. "She is the final witness." He turned, already at the door. "We must reach her before Lucian does. If we're fortunate, he's still preparing. He's not a killer by nature. He's a man wounded and desperate. But desperation becomes dangerous when it feels righteous." The carriage ride to Preston Fields took little more than 20 minutes, but each second seemed suspended with tension. The wind had picked up, and the clouds had begun to churn with sea-born fury. The narrow lane to Lady Marbury's home was flanked by sycamores whose bare branches rattled in the dark, like bones in the grip of winter. The house itself was of red brick, proud but aged, with ivy climbing its east face and a wrought-iron gate that creaked as we passed through. A servant answered our knock, a thin woman with a startled expression and a shawl clutched at her throat. "We must speak with Lady Marbury at once," Holmes said. "It is a matter of urgent protection." The woman hesitated, then ushered us in. We were led through a dim corridor to a drawing room filled with the perfume of dried lavender and the ticking of a long-case clock. Lady Adeline Marbury rose from her seat with a grace that belied her years. She was tall, elegant, with silver hair pinned in a crown and eyes that had seen too much. "Mr. Holmes," she said without surprise. "I thought you might come." Holmes inclined his head. "You were warned?" "Not directly. But I read the obituary for Elliot Barrowman. I have read 4 such notices in the past 3 weeks, all men who once handled the Barrowman estate in some capacity. I knew it could not be coincidence." Holmes stepped forward. "Do you know Lucian?" She sighed and sat again. "Not by name, but I know the story. Reginald, he had a son, not acknowledged, a mistake from his years abroad. He told me once when we were young and still engaged. He said he'd given the boy's mother money and silence. But I think it haunted him. Reginald had many failings, but he could not bear shame. He thought wealth could erase the past. Did he ever try to reconnect with the child? Not to my knowledge, but I suspect the boy grew up knowing enough to follow the money. And now with Reginald gone, we heard the knock at the front door before she finished her sentence. Holmes turned, his voice cutting like a whip. Keep her in this room. Lock the door behind me. Watson, come. We were down the corridor in 3 strides. The servant had already opened the door. Lucian Barrowman stood on the step, coat damp with sea mist, eyes hollow, but burning with restrained purpose. He blinked at us, not surprised. I knew you would come, he said. His voice was quiet, measured. Lucian, Holmes said evenly. She knows. She remembers. Something flickered in Lucian's face, grief, recognition, uncertainty, then resolve. I don't want to harm her, he said, but she let it happen. She knew what they did. The inheritance, the lies, my father's silence. All those men, Blake, Elliot, they bought their comfort with my name in the dust. She is not your enemy, Holmes said gently, but if you walk through that door with intent, you will become one. Lucian's eyes welled, but he did not move. I only wanted to belong, he said. Not to beg, not to be erased. Holmes took a step forward. And you will belong. But not like this. Let her speak. Let truth speak, Lucian wavered. For a moment I thought he would flee, or worse. But then slowly he lowered his head. I have no more letters left, he whispered. Holmes nodded. Then let us write the last one together. And with that, the storm finally broke, not in violence, but in the quiet fall of a man who had only ever wanted to be seen. The wind beat softly against the windows of Lady Marbury's drawing room as Holmes and I sat across from Lucian Barrowman, now without coat or gloves, his dark hair damp with mist and his eyes strangely empty. Lady Marbury remained seated, still composed, though her hands clasped each other so tightly in her lap that the lace at her cuffs trembled. Holmes had insisted we all remain there together. No threats, no police, not yet. Instead, the detective had requested tea, of all things, as if civility might yet coax a confession more powerful than accusation. And curiously, it seemed to work. Lucian, for the first time in what might have been years, sat without being chased. No false names, no fleeing lodgings in the dawn light, just the heavy, disorienting quiet of being seen. I didn't kill Blake, he said at last, his voice thin and hoarse. Nor Elliot, I swear that. Holmes's gaze did not shift from him. But you did confront them. Lucian gave a single nod. Yes, I wanted them to feel what I had felt for years, ignored, discarded. I thought if I could place doubt in their minds, make them feel the injustice, perhaps they'd step forward, acknowledge the fraud and allow my claim to be heard again. And when they didn't, I asked gently. Lucian looked down. I sent letters. Anonymous ones. I typed them at a public library. I wanted them to know someone was watching, that their comfort had a cost. Blake received his and died the next day. I swear I never touched him. Elliot, he swallowed. He laughed when he saw me. Called me an Eastern ghost. You visited Elliot in person? Holmes asked. I left a parcel. He recognized me. But he dismissed me again, as they all had, as though I had no right to even stand before him. I burned the second letter to cover my tracks. I was frightened. I never meant for any of it to end in death. Lady Marbury's voice, steady and low, broke the moment. Lucian, tell me, what do you want now? He met her eyes, something pained and raw rising behind the restraint. Recognition. That my father existed beyond his ledgers and letters. That I was not a mistake to be covered with wealth and buried in silence. She sat back slowly. He told me of you just once. He said he couldn't bring you to England, not then. His father would have disowned him. He said he tried to send money, to ensure you had schooling, but he was a coward. He believed a quiet absence was the kindest cruelty. Lucian blinked, stunned. He said that to you? Yes, but I was not brave enough to ask more. Holmes leaned forward. Lucian, there's more you haven't said. Something about the sequence of these deaths doesn't align. Blake and Elliot both died mysteriously and too soon. You wanted to be seen, not to vanish behind suspicion. So I ask again, not as an officer of the law, but as a seeker of truth, did you poison Elliot Barrowman? Lucian held Holmes's gaze. No, I left the parcel and left. That was all. Holmes stood and began to pace slowly. Then someone else intervened. Someone who wanted to silence the very truth you were trying to reveal. Lucian's head tilted. Who? Holmes's brow furrowed. That is what remains. You were not the only one watching. Someone else has been following these same events. You triggered a chain, Lucian, but another hand exploited it. We must ask, who else stood to lose if your claim were proven? I felt a slow realization bloom in my chest. If Reginald's estate had passed fraudulently to Elliot, and Elliot then to another, that person would have a very real reason to ensure the past stayed buried. Holmes nodded. Precisely. There is an heir we've yet to see, someone who benefited from both deaths. If that person forged or suppressed documents and feared exposure, Lucian's sudden reappearance would have been more than an inconvenience. It would have been a threat. Lady Marbury's brow furrowed. But Reginald had no other known kin beyond Elliot. Holmes stopped. Then the answer lies in the will, or lack of it. We must return to Somerset House. If Elliot Barrowman filed for secondary probate or attempted to draft a new will following his inheritance, that act might have named a successor. And if so, our murderer may be hidden in legal ink. We returned to London that same evening, bringing Lucian with us. Holmes arranged for him to stay at a quiet boarding house in Kensington under watch, not as a prisoner, but as a necessary witness. Scotland Yard was informed of Blake and Elliot's probable poisonings, but Lestrade, who had learned to trust Holmes's instinct, even when it defied procedure, agreed to hold back official charges, for now. The next morning we returned to Somerset House, where Holmes requested not only Reginald Barrowman's file, but that of Elliot's as well. The clerk obliged, and we were shown to a reading table in a sunlit alcove. Holmes flipped through the second file with quick fingers until he paused. Here, he murmured. Filed 4 days before Elliot's death. I peered over his shoulder. It was a draft will, unsigned, but clearly in Elliot's handwriting. It named a beneficiary, Beatrice Dunlow, Holmes read aloud. Her distant cousin by marriage, little known. No legal claim to Reginald's estate through blood. Then Elliot meant to divert the inheritance. I said, or return it to someone who helped him fabricate the original claim, Holmes said grimly. It's possible she was the architect of it all. Perhaps she had forged the Romanian documents Lucian brought and helped Elliot supplant the rightful heir. I frowned. But why kill Elliot? Because Elliot had begun to reconsider. He received Lucian's letter, remembered the original deception, and perhaps felt remorse. Enough to change the will, enough to name a new heir, and Beatrice couldn't allow that. Holmes rose abruptly. We must find her. If she administered the tea at Elliot's house, or had access to his schedule, then we may place her at the very scene of his death. Where do we begin? Holmes's mouth curved in that rare, dangerous way of his. We visit the one man who always knows where society's misfits live. Mr. Langford, the genealogist. Langford's shop was a crooked doorway between a tobacconist and a used bookseller in Soho. The man himself was stooped, papery, and dusted in ink like an artifact. But his records were unmatched. Holmes provided the name and approximate relation, and within 20 minutes we had an address. Beatrice Dunlow, Holmes said quietly. Camden Row. Let us see what truth she has preserved and what she has erased. We made our way north as a storm gathered once more over London's skyline. I could not shake the sensation that this last step was not an end, but the threshold of something deeper, that beneath the tangle of inheritance and loss, of faded names and forged identities, there remained one final deception waiting to be revealed. And, if Holmes's instincts were right, as they so often were, it would be Beatrice Dunlow who held the last piece of this shadowed puzzle in her hand. Camden Row lay tucked behind the market streets of Kentish Town, a line of terraced houses once grand, but now touched by the slow erosion of time. The rain had returned, a fine, needling drizzle that beaded on Holmes's collar and cast the cobbles in a shimmer of grey. We stood before number 18, a modest red brick house with lace curtains drawn tight behind the lower windows. No sign hung by the door. No flower pots brightened the step. The house gave nothing of itself. Not warmth, not welcome, only stillness. Holmes rapped twice with the back of his knuckle. We waited. A faint shuffling sounded beyond the door, the scrape of a latch, then a pause just long enough to suggest hesitation. At last it opened, and a woman of perhaps 50 stood framed in the gap, her expression unreadable. She wore a deep blue dress with a high collar, fastened too tightly at the throat, and her pale hands clutched the edge of the door with deliberate care. "Yes?" she said softly. "Miss Dunlow?" Holmes asked. She inclined her head. "My name is Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. John Watson. We are investigating the circumstances surrounding the deaths of Mr. Nathaniel Blake and Mr. Elliot Barrowman. We believe you may be able to assist." Her eyes flicked between us, quick as a sparrow's. "I know of their passing," she said, her voice barely rising above the patter of rain on the steps. "But I had no contact with either man in years." Holmes smiled faintly. "And yet you were recently named in Mr. Barrowman's final will." For a moment, her mouth opened as if to protest, but she closed it again, visibly restraining herself. Then she stepped back and opened the door wider. "Please come in." The interior was as spare as the exterior, neat, immaculately so, but with an air of preservation rather than comfort. Nothing seemed to have been used recently. The teacups were stacked, unchipped but dusty. The mantel clock ticked too loudly in the silence. Holmes's eyes moved over everything, drinking it in as though he were reading the margins of a confession. Beatrice Dunlow sat across from us in the parlour, hands now folded neatly in her lap. Holmes remained standing, restless, as though still chasing something invisible just beyond reach. "I imagine," she began, "you have questions. I suggest we speak plainly." "Very well," Holmes said. "You were involved in the processing of Reginald Barrowman's estate." She gave a single nod. "Only peripherally. Elliot asked for my assistance in organizing some paperwork, documents in Romanian chiefly. He knew I had spent time in that region. Did you forge the birth certificate that supported Elliot's claim to the estate?" "No," she said, and for once there was no hesitation. "That document was presented to me by Elliot. I translated it, but the names were already in place. You were not aware that Lucian Barrowman, the true son, had filed a rival claim?" She hesitated. "I knew of the name. I didn't believe it was legitimate." Holmes's expression darkened. "Yet when Lucian reappeared, and Elliot began to reconsider the distribution of the estate, he drafted a new will. You were named as the sole heir." "I didn't ask to be named," she replied quietly. "Elliot told me it was a gesture of thanks for helping him when others would not." Holmes took a slow step forward. "That's a generous gesture, and a dangerous one if you feared he might change his mind again." Beatrice's lips tightened. "I did not poison him." "Then where were you on the morning of Elliot's death?" A pause. "Here, can anyone confirm that?" She looked away. "No." Holmes let the silence hang like a blade. Then abruptly he turned and walked to a small writing desk in the corner. From a drawer, left slightly ajar, he drew out a sheaf of paper, neatly bundled and labelled in ink, E. Barrowman final draft, unsigned. He laid it gently on the table. "You kept a copy," he said. "Insurance, perhaps." Her eyes flickered to the pages, but she said nothing. Holmes's voice softened, though it did not grow less sharp. "Miss Dunlow, 2 men are dead. Their names are being dragged through suspicion while the truth lies here, in this quiet house. You may not have poured poison into Elliot's cup, but you knew of the fraud. You helped him displace a rightful heir. And when Lucian returned, not as a threat but as a wounded son, you did nothing to set the past straight." Beatrice stood slowly, her frame trembling slightly. "I did what I thought was right," she said. "Lucian was a phantom. His documents questionable, his story impossible to verify. Elliot feared scandal. He thought he could settle things quietly. And when he changed his mind..." She looked at the wall, her voice thin. "I warned him not to. I told him it would unravel everything. That the Barrowman name could not survive another scandal. That giving the estate to a man no court would recognize would only end in disgrace. And so he died." Her breath caught. "I didn't kill him, Mr. Holmes. But someone did," Holmes said. "And you're protecting them." She didn't answer. Instead, she sat again and drew a handkerchief from her sleeve. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, without raising her eyes, it was his manservant. Elias. He had been with Elliot for years. When Lucian returned, Elliot began speaking to him of regrets, of setting things right. Elias believed I would be disinherited, that Elliot had been manipulated. He told me he'd take care of it. I didn't know what he meant until it was done. "And you said nothing," I said. She shook her head. "I couldn't. Elias is gone. He vanished the morning Elliot died. I've not heard from him since." Holmes turned to me. It fits. Elias knew the household rhythms, could slip something into a morning cup without notice. He saw Lucian as a usurper, you as the rightful heir. He acted on his own. But she knew, I said quietly. She let it happen. Holmes turned back to Beatrice. The law may not convict you, but you will have to answer for the truth. I suggest you surrender the will and every related document to the authorities. She nodded slowly, the weight of silence finally pressing her shoulders downward. Outside, the rain had begun to ease. Holmes and I walked the long stretch back toward Camden High Street without speaking. At last I asked what had settled in my thoughts. What will become of Lucian? Holmes glanced upward. That depends. On the courts, yes, but more so on how the public receives the story. Blake, Elliot, Beatrice, they built a wall of polite deceit. Lucian tore it down with grief and stubborn dignity. He wanted a name, I said. Holmes nodded. And now he has one. By the time we reached the station, the clouds had parted slightly, the first rays of sun catching on the rooftops as if London itself had exhaled. The case, though tangled in inheritance, deception, and death, had never truly been about money. It had been about being remembered, about whose name was allowed to survive history. And as the train pulled from the platform, Holmes sat beside me, gaze turned not to the tracks behind, but to the path ahead where truth, though delayed, had finally caught up with the living. The train rolled steadily through the outskirts of the city, its rhythmic clatter on the rails, a quiet percussion beneath our thoughts. Holmes sat motionless, his gloved fingers steepled before his face, his eyes half-lidded but far from restful. He had not spoken since we left Camden, and I knew the expression well. It was the calm that cloaked deeper deduction, a silence wound tightly with threads of unfinished reasoning. Outside the rain-washed window, the city blurred, chimneys, rooftops, fleeting glimpses of London's somber afternoon unfolding in greys and rusts. The truth had been laid bare, or so it seemed. Beatrice Dunlow had spoken. The trail of lies, old, brittle, and long concealed, had finally cracked under the weight of a forgotten name. Yet even in that apparent resolution, Holmes's stillness unsettled me. "You don't believe it's over," I said at last. He didn't stir. "No," I waited, then prompted gently, "What remains?" His gaze shifted toward the window, but not to the view, somewhere beyond it, as though searching backward in time. Beatrice gave us a name, Elias, the loyal servant who turned poisoner in misguided devotion. It completes the narrative and perhaps satisfies the law, but there is a fracture in the grain of the tale, Watson. Something too clean, too convenient, I frowned. "You believe she lied?" "I believe she bent the truth to shield something more precious than reputation." We passed a copse of leafless trees before the skyline swallowed the horizon once more. Holmes exhaled softly. "She claimed Elias disappeared the morning of Elliot's death. No word, no letter, no sign. But that, you see, is the problem." He turned toward me, his voice low and tight with calculation. "Why vanish at all? If Elias acted out of loyalty, convinced Elliot had been misled, why not remain? Why not defend his actions as necessary? Our servant's silent disappearance, without justification or plea, suggests not loyalty, but fear. Fear of prosecution?" I offered. "Perhaps. But then why murder in the first place? He had no personal gain. He was not named in the will. If his motive was to preserve Beatrice's claim, surely he would have remained to see it enforced." Holmes leaned back in his seat, his tone darkening. "No, Watson. Elias is either dead or he never existed." I stared. "Invented?" Holmes nodded once, his expression grim. "A name is easily assigned to a ghost. Beatrice Dunlow has always lived alone. No records tie Elias to her household. No neighbors mentioned him. No staff reported his presence. And consider the peculiar elegance of the lie. He vanishes precisely when it is needed most, carrying with him both guilt and resolution." My pulse quickened. "Then Beatrice killed Elliot herself. She knew he was changing the will. She feared the inheritance slipping away, not just from herself, but from the very narrative she'd helped build. Lucian's return destabilized everything she had reinforced with forged documents and whispered doubts. She gave Elliot the poison herself, perhaps disguised in routine. And now with his death she weaves a final fiction, a phantom servant to carry the blame. But why speak to us at all?" I asked. "Why not remain silent and let suspicion fall elsewhere?" Holmes's mouth thinned. because she feared silence would implicate her even more deeply. So she confessed just enough to appear honest. She handed us a key while hiding the true door. The train slowed as we reached Victoria Station. Holmes stood abruptly, already folding his gloves into his pocket. "We are not returning to Baker Street," he said. "Not yet." I rose to follow him. "Where then?" "To the registry office. If Elias never existed, we'll find no employment record, no census entry, no birth certificate. And if we find anything, we must be prepared for it to be forged." We arrived at the office by 4:30. The day's clerks were beginning to stack files and prepare for closing, but the name Sherlock Holmes still held sufficient sway to grant us swift access. Holmes requested domestic employment records for one Elias Gray, servant to Mr. Elliot Barrowman of Stepney. The results came back quickly. There was no such man, no birth registration, no household entry, no tax ledger, no servant license, nothing. Holmes gave a short breath, more confirmation than relief. "She wrote him into the story like a stagehand," he murmured. "And now, Watson, we do the only thing left." I nodded, though I dreaded the conclusion. Confront her again. Camden Row was nearly lost in dusk by the time we arrived, its windows dim, the gas lamps along the narrow street only just beginning to glow behind swirls of early evening fog. Holmes did not knock. He strode to the door and rapped sharply with his cane. 3 precise strikes, no answer. He tried again. Still nothing. We glanced at each other, and Holmes, without hesitation, tried the latch. It opened. The interior was quiet, heavy with the scent of extinguished oil and lavender. We stepped in, calling Beatrice's name, but received no reply. The parlour was untouched, teacups where we had left them, the hearth now cold. Holmes moved swiftly to the writing desk. The drawer was ajar once more, empty. "Gone," he said tightly. I moved to the kitchen. Her coat was missing from the hook. A small valise usually tucked beneath the stairs had vanished. "She's fled," I said, re-entering the front room. Holmes shook his head. "No, she's moving. She's completing her escape, burning what remains." We were back on the street in moments, and Holmes hailed the nearest cab with a whistle that cut through the fog like a blade. "To Paddington Station," he ordered. "Now, fast!" I clambered in beside him. "I think she's fleeing the city." "She's an intelligent woman, Watson, and desperate. She knows her time is limited. Her forged heir is dead, the real one has emerged, and her ghostly scapegoat has vanished beneath scrutiny. She needs distance, and quickly." At Paddington, we burst into the departure hall just as the 6:05 for Exeter was being called. The crowds were thick, cloaks and hats moving like shadows beneath the high arches. Holmes scanned the queue, then motioned me toward the southern platform. "There," he said. Beatrice Dunlow stood near the middle of the queue, a brown coat belted tightly, her valise in hand. She had turned her collar up against the cold, and her hat shaded her face, but there was no mistaking her profile. Holmes approached slowly, not as a pursuer, but as a man greeting an acquaintance in passing. "Miss Dunlow," he said gently. She turned, and though surprise passed through her features, she did not recoil. She looked tired, worn down, but not afraid. "I wondered how long it would take," she said. Holmes inclined his head. "You're not boarding?" "No," she agreed. "But I needed to appear as though I was, to see if you would follow." "Why?" "Because I wanted to know if you believed me, if my story would hold, and it nearly did," Holmes said softly. "But ghosts rarely leave footprints, and Elias left too many that led nowhere." She closed her eyes for a long moment, then opened them with a sigh. "I didn't mean for it to go that far. I only wanted certainty." Elliot was faltering. He began to speak of absolution, of debts that could not be paid in coin. You silenced him, I calmed him. I gave him peace as he sat in his chair. I spoke of legacy, of closure, and yes, I sweetened his tea. Holmes said nothing. The noise of the platform swelled and fell again as passengers filed onto the train behind them. "I won't run," she said. "There's no point now." Holmes's voice was quiet. "There never was." She looked toward the darkening horizon beyond the rails, her face still. "Tell Lucian," she said, "that I am sorry, truly. I never meant to erase him. Only to preserve what I thought was already broken." Holmes nodded once, then raised his hand, signaling to the constable posted near the gate. As the train pulled away into the dark, the mist rose higher, swallowing its glow. And with it, the last breath of a fiction that had nearly rewritten a man's name from history. The air outside Paddington was sharp and clean, as though the fog had been scrubbed from the streets by some invisible hand. Holmes and I stepped out into the early night, the lamps above the arches casting long golden pools across the pavement. Behind us, Beatrice Dunlow was escorted quietly away by the constable, her valise clutched tightly in her gloved hand, her expression unreadable to those who didn't know the truth. We said nothing for several minutes. Holmes stood still near the cab rank, his eyes lowered, his brow resting lightly against the tip of his cane. A part of him always mourned, I think, when the tale ended not with a tidy arrest but with the frayed emotions of lives undone by their own weight. Beatrice had not been monstrous. Her crimes were deliberate, yes, but not cold. They had come from fear, of vanishing, of being left behind, of a life spent quietly forgotten while the Barrowman name passed on without her. At last Holmes turned to me. "There's one last visit to make, Watson," he said, his voice low but certain. I nodded. "Lucian. He deserves the truth, clean, unembellished. We've chased ghosts long enough." We took a cab to Kensington, where Lucian remained under quiet watch at the small boarding house Holmes had arranged. He had kept to himself, the landlady told us, reading often by the fire, venturing out only for short walks. When we entered the front room, he stood immediately, his features drawn with sleeplessness but alert, as if always halfway prepared for disappointment. He studied our faces carefully. "Is it done?" Holmes approached and sat opposite him. He did not speak at once. He opened the moment gently, like unfolding a letter that had waited too long to be read. "She confessed," he said. Lucian lowered his gaze. "Beatrice?" "Yes, she poisoned Elliot. She feared he would name you as the rightful heir. She told herself it was an act of protection. In the end, she nearly succeeded in writing you out of history." Lucian's hands tightened into fists against his knees. He exhaled slowly, then said, "Did she say why she hated me?" "She didn't hate you," Holmes replied. "She feared what you represented, a truth that couldn't be ignored. The restoration of a name that threatened to unravel the life she had constructed from silence." Lucian looked up, his jaw clenched. "And now what am I left with? My father is long buried. The men who erased me are gone, and she only weeps for a legacy that was never hers." Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew a thin envelope. He placed it gently on the table between them. "This is a copy of Elliot's final draft, the real one." Before she intervened, "It names you as heir. Not in apology, but in recognition." He had begun to understand what was stolen from you. Lucian stared at the envelope, unmoving. "Elliot was a coward," he said quietly. "But even cowards leave footprints, don't they?" Holmes nodded. "Sometimes it takes the fall of an empire for the truth to leave its mark." Lucian picked up the envelope and held it in his hands as though it might vanish if he let go. "And the law?" "You'll need to petition the courts to reopen probate," Holmes said. "With testimony and documentation, they may restore your rightful claim. I've already arranged for a barrister who specializes in contested estates. Discreet, capable." Lucian nodded slowly. "And Beatrice? She will face trial, but her confession and her cooperation may spare her the harshest judgment." There was silence for a time. Lucian stared into the low-burning fire, his expression unreadable. "I don't want the house," he said after a while. "Nor the money, not yet. Maybe not ever." Holmes tilted his head. "Then what do you want?" Lucian turned his eyes to him. "To be seen, to be known by my name. That's all I ever asked." Holmes gave a faint smile, barely more than a flicker. "Then take it. Write it into the world with your own hand." As we left the boarding house, the street outside was hushed and still. Holmes paused on the corner and lit a cigarette, the flame casting brief light against his pale features. He looked far down the road as though glimpsing something none of us yet could. "I sometimes wonder, Watson," he said, "how many names lie buried beneath ink and silence. How many histories have been rewritten because no one cared enough to question the handwriting?" I fell into step beside him. "Too many, I suppose." He didn't answer, but I could see the shape of the case settling within his mind. It had begun with a letter from the dead, twisted into something theatrical. But beneath it had been a much quieter story. A son forgotten, a woman afraid, a solicitor silenced by guilt, and a string of lies that snapped only when seen through the sharp eye of truth. At Baker Street, Mrs. Hudson greeted us with a pot of fresh tea already waiting. Holmes removed his coat and settled into his chair without the usual drama. A signal, that the weight of the past few days still clung to him. I sat opposite him, and for a long while we said nothing. The fire crackled gently, the tea steamed between us, and the clock above the mantel kept time in the language only silence understands. Finally, Holmes spoke, not to me but to the room, as if filing the last line into the ledger of memory. "Watson, do you recall what Reginald Barrowman's obituary said?" I thought back. Something like, "He leaves behind no immediate heirs, but a legacy of distinguished service and private generosity." Holmes gave a soft laugh. "Indeed, no heirs, and yet one lived. And his only request was not for legacy but for recognition." I set down my cup. "And now he has both." Holmes looked toward the window. The fog was returning, curling along the glass like breath. "No," he said quietly. "Now he has the chance to choose what his story will become." That night I did not write in my journal. I found I did not need to. The case had imprinted itself in my mind with a clarity that no ink could improve. It had been unlike our usual pursuits. No master criminal, no jewel thieves or disappearing trains. Just a tangle of silence and forgotten names and the soft, insistent voice of a man who refused to be invisible. And somehow, in the quiet of that long day's ending, it seemed the most human mystery of them all. 2 mornings later, I was awakened by the sound of Holmes pacing. I found him in the sitting room, his dressing gown wrapped carelessly about him, his violin untouched in its corner, and a letter clutched in his right hand like a verdict not yet spoken aloud. The windows were open despite the chill, and the grey London air drifted inside, stirring the curtains like an unsettled ghost. He did not look up when I entered. "You've read it," he said simply. I blinked away the remnants of sleep. "Read what?" He extended the envelope wordlessly. I took it and opened the folded page inside. The handwriting was bold, deliberate. "Lucian's, Mr. Holmes. I am leaving London today. Not to escape, but to begin. There is nothing for me in courtrooms or estates, at least not yet. I intend to return to Bucharest, to the town where my mother lived. There are records there I must face, faces I must learn, and names no one has written down. When I return, I shall carry both Barrowman and my own name, not as a weapon or inheritance, but as truth. Whatever comes, thank you for seeing me." LBI folded the letter in silence. Holmes turned from the window. "He understands something most of London never will, that a name carries more weight when it's chosen rather than inherited. And you believe he'll come back?" "I think he must." Holmes moved to the hearth and placed the letter on the mantel, beside the Persian slipper he used for tobacco. "He will not find peace in the past, but he will need it to construct the future." I poured myself a cup of tea, the porcelain clinking softly. "Still, it's a quiet end. No arrest in the Strand, no great headlines. Only a man leaving London with more dignity than he arrived with." Holmes gave a rare, faint smile. "Not every case ends with applause. Sometimes the resolution is quieter, more enduring." We passed the remainder of the morning in our usual fashion, Holmes drifting between his chemistry apparatus and the fireplace, I with a copy of the Times, scanning without interest until a small column caught my eye. I read the lines twice before lowering the page. "Holmes," I said, "have a look at this." He crossed the room in 3 long strides and leaned over my shoulder as I read, "Unclaimed death in Shoreditch. A man of Eastern European appearance was found deceased yesterday morning near Haggerston Canal. Authorities suspect exposure, though no identification was found on the body. Witnesses report he had been seen frequenting nearby public houses in recent days. Scotland Yard is seeking next of kin." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Eastern European, no identification. No mention of violence, but neither of illness. Do you think it might be Elias?" I asked, if he ever existed. Holmes was already reaching for his coat. "If Beatrice invented him, the matter is closed. But if she borrowed the name, then we may yet uncover one final thread." We arrived at the coroner's office in Whitechapel by midday. Holmes spoke briefly with the registrar and was promptly admitted. The body lay on a stone slab beneath a white cloth, his boots removed, a faint blue cast to the skin. Holmes studied the man's face carefully, then turned to the coroner, a tidy, officious man named Elford. "No visible wounds?" Holmes asked. "None, no bruising, no indication of struggle. No track marks. No alcohol in the stomach, no poison in the lungs. Just exposure, no identification at all." Elford hesitated. "Only this." He produced a folded slip of paper sealed in a clear pouch. Holmes took it with delicate care. It was brittle, water-stained, but legible, to the one who bore the burden. "Forgive me. I was never meant to be written in ink." Holmes read it again, then handed it to me. I understood the meaning at once. It wasn't a confession. It was an ending. "Elias," I said softly. Holmes turned to Elford. "Where was he found?" "Shoreditch, near the canal, curled in his coat. No witnesses, no friends. Only this note." Holmes didn't speak for a long moment. Then quietly, "Have the letter preserved. Send a copy to the inspector in charge of Beatrice Dunlow's case. She will want to see it, though she may not deserve to." We stepped back into the chill of the street. The fog had returned, rolling through the alleys with indifferent grace. Holmes paused at the curb, hands deep in his pockets. "She did not lie entirely then," I said. "There was an Elias." He nodded slowly. "But she didn't tell us the whole truth either. Elias was not a servant. He was a man who loved her. Perhaps once, perhaps still. She hid him because he was her witness, her accomplice by omission, and in the end her silence was his sentence. And his last act, to vanish, as all good ghosts must." We returned to Baker Street before dusk. Holmes moved slowly that evening, lighting his pipe but never smoking it, letting the smoke drift upward in slow spirals. I knew better than to question the mood. It was not grief but reverence. A certain quietness that descended upon him when the story's final page had been turned, and its weight still pressed against his thoughts. Before I retired, I found him at the window, watching the clouds turn to silver. "I shall write to Lestrade," he said softly. "Tell him to mark Elias's grave. No pauper's stone. Just a name. He deserves that much." I nodded. "And Lucian?" Holmes turned to me. "Lucian will write his name in full one day without needing my help." He paused. "And when he does, Watson, I expect he will do so not in ink, but in something far more permanent." In the days that followed, the city moved on as cities do. The papers made only brief mention of Beatrice Dunlow's arrest, and even less of the Barrowman estate. The courts would deliberate for months, but Holmes declined to involve himself further. He said what needed to be seen had already been seen, and that was justice enough. It was several weeks later when a letter arrived by post, addressed in strong, angular handwriting. I opened it slowly and smiled. "Dr. Watson, I write from Iashi. I've located the church where my mother was baptized. Her name is carved into the stone beside the font, Irina Barrowman, though they spelled it as Barrowman. The priest remembered her. He told me something else, too, that when my father came here in 1872, he brought a silver cross from London and left it in the chapel. He said it was meant for her. I'm not sure if he ever loved her, but I've chosen to believe he did. Thank you for everything. When I return, I will come to Baker Street. Lucian B. I showed the letter to Holmes. He read it once, then folded it carefully and tucked it into the inside pocket of his coat, and that was all he said. But as I watched him later that night, standing once more at the fire, I saw his hand move to that pocket without thinking, fingertips brushing against the paper as if to confirm it was still there. A gesture of memory, a gesture of meaning. In time, the case of the man who claimed his own murder faded from public view, but I never forgot it, because in the end, it was not murder that Holmes unraveled. It was something stranger, something older. It was the theft of identity and the restoration of it. Quietly, fully, with the most difficult kind of justice, the kind that leaves no headlines, only a name, finally returned to its rightful place. It was early spring when Lucian Barrowman returned to London. The letter had arrived in late March, short, unadorned, and without flourish. He had written simply that his affairs abroad were settled, that the records in Iashi had confirmed what Holmes had long suspected, and that he was ready to begin the process of reclaiming his father's name, not for vengeance, but for restoration. There was no mention of Elliot, of Beatrice, or even of the estate. Only a quiet sentence at the close, "I will come to Baker Street one last time." And so on a mild morning in April we heard his knock. Holmes rose from his chair and opened the door himself. Lucian stood in the threshold, his figure leaner, his coat dusted from travel, but his eyes were clearer now, no longer searching, no longer shadowed. There was a steadiness to him that had not been present before. He carried nothing with him except a folded document under his arm. "I've filed the petition," he said. "With the courts. The estate will be examined again. Not because of what it's worth, but because of what was taken." Holmes gestured for him to sit, and Lucien took the chair opposite the hearth. I poured tea while Holmes examined the folded paper Lucien had brought. It was a notarized request, formal, legal, but the language spoke not of anger or entitlement, only of truth. "You have every legal right now," Holmes said. "The draft Elliot prepared, the evidence we've assembled, it's enough. Even without Beatrice's full confession, the court will have little choice but to acknowledge the deception." Lucien nodded. "That's not the part I feared, no?" I asked. He looked at me, then at Holmes. "I feared what it would mean to be seen. To live in the open bearing his name." Holmes studied him quietly. "And now? Now I know what to do with it." He stood and extended a hand to Holmes. "Thank you for not letting my story be another obituary." Holmes shook it. "You gave it meaning. I only turned over the stones." Lucien left shortly after, walking down Baker Street with his head held high, no longer glancing behind him. We stood in the window a while after he'd gone, Holmes silently smoking, I finishing the last of my tea. There was a finality in the air, not of something ended, but something completed. "He will do well," I said at last. Holmes nodded. "Dames, Watson, are fragile things. They can be buried, forged, even sold. But when reclaimed, honestly, humbly, they become the truest currency a man owns. And Beatrice? She awaits trial. Her solicitors are pleading diminished responsibility, rooted in grief and fear. They may succeed in lessening the punishment, but not the weight of what she did. And Elias, a name borrowed, a man forgotten, but no longer faceless." That night I wrote the final line of my notes on the case, though I hesitated before putting pen to paper. I knew it would never be one of the great public cases of Holmes's career. There were no daring chases, no notorious criminals, no jewels or royal entanglements, and yet it was perhaps one of the most human cases we had ever encountered. A man predicted his own murder, but it was not a prophecy. It was a protest, a plea not to be erased, and through Holmes's tireless mind, and the weight of quiet truth, that man had been restored, not with ceremony, but with understanding. As I laid down my pen, Holmes spoke from across the room, not looking up from his chair. "Watson," he said, "I hope, should anyone ever misplace me in the record, you'll have the courtesy to write me back in." I smiled. "Always, Holmes," and the fire crackled quietly on as the evening deepened, London vast and sprawling outside our window, filled with names waiting to be remembered.